when her wealthy aristocratic in-laws handed her the deed to a mosquito-infested swamp. It was meant as a final, humiliating insult. They thought they were abandoning her to a worthless expanse of deep, stagnant mud. They had absolutely no idea they had just handed her a multi-million-dollar hidden empire. Madeline Foster never fit into the Hayes family portrait. Raised in a cramped two-bedroom ranch house in Ohio by a single mother who worked as a diner waitress, Madeline knew the value of $1, the weight of an honest day's work, and the reality of living paycheck to paycheck. She was a pediatric nurse, compassionate, grounded, and undeniably entirely ordinary in the eyes of the ultra-elite. When she met Jonathan Hayes in the cafeteria of the Boston hospital, where he was recovering from a minor ski injury, the connection was immediate and electric. Jonathan was different from his family. He possessed a warmth and a humility that completely belied his status as the heir to the Hayes shipping and logistics empire. He didn't care that Madeline drove a rusted 12-year-old sedan, or that her idea of a vacation was camping in state parks rather than summering in the French Riviera. He fell in love with her fierce independence and genuine kindness. But Jonathan's parents, Margaret and Charles Hayes, saw Madeline as an opportunistic parasite. To them, she was a gold digger orchestrating a long con. Margaret, a woman whose icy demeanor was matched only by the flawless cut of her designer suits, made her disdain known from their very first introduction. During family dinners at their sprawling Connecticut estate, Margaret would offer backhanded compliments about Madeline's quaint upbringing, while Charles would actively ignore her, speaking to Jonathan about corporate acquisitions as if Madeline were entirely invisible. Despite the psychological warfare waged by his parents, Jonathan proposed to Madeline on a rainy Tuesday in her small apartment, far away from the oppressive grandeur of his family's wealth. They planned a modest wedding, much to Margaret's vocal horror. It was at the rehearsal dinner that the Hayes family delivered their first major blow. Margaret and Charles stood before the intimate gathering of guests to present the couple with their wedding gifts. To Jonathan, they dramatically handed over the keys and deed to a pristine, 6-bedroom colonial home in an exclusive Boston suburb, a property placed strictly in a trust under Jonathan's name alone. Then Margaret turned to Madeline. With a thin, calculating smile, she handed her a faded manila envelope. "And for the bride," Margaret announced, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "a piece of land of her very own, so you will always remember where you stand, my dear." Inside was a deed to 14 acres of land in Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana. It sounded substantial until Jonathan looked up the coordinates later that night. It wasn't a buildable lot. It wasn't agricultural land. It was a literal swamp, a sunken, mosquito-ridden tract of stagnant water, decaying vegetation, and impenetrable mud. The property had been acquired by Charles decades ago as part of a bankrupt company's liquidated assets and had been entirely forgotten because it was deemed utterly unbuildable and commercially worthless. Giving it to Madeline was a masterclass in passive-aggressive cruelty. It was a tangible, legal way for Margaret and Charles to call her trash. Madeline kept the deed. She refused to give Margaret the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She tucked it away in a shoebox at the bottom of her closet, determined to focus on her new life with Jonathan. For 3 years they were blissfully happy. Jonathan distanced himself from his family's toxic dynamics, and Madeline continued her nursing career. They were trying for a baby. Life was beautiful. Then the unthinkable happened. It was a Tuesday evening in November. Jonathan had been complaining of a headache for a few days, brushing it off as stress. While driving home from his office, a previously undetected cerebral aneurysm ruptured. He lost consciousness behind the wheel. By the time the paramedics extracted him from the wreckage of his car, he was gone. Madeleine's world shattered into a million jagged pieces. The grief was a physical weight, crushing the breath from her lungs. But she was not allowed the grace to mourn in peace. Before Jonathan was even laid to rest, Margaret and Charles unleashed a fleet of high-powered corporate attorneys. Because Jonathan had died suddenly, without a finalized, updated will, and because his major assets, including the house they lived in and his bank accounts, were tied up in the impenetrable Hayes family trusts, Madeleine was legally boxed out. The attorneys utilized every ruthless legal loophole available to argue that Madeleine was entitled to almost nothing. The Hayes family evicted the grieving widow from the Boston home just 3 weeks after the funeral. Broken, exhausted, and financially drained from attorney fees trying to fight the eviction, Madeleine was forced to pack her belongings into her rusted sedan. She had a few $1,000s in savings, her nursing scrubs, and a shoebox of memories. At the bottom of that box lay the deed to the Terrebonne Parish swamp. It was the only piece of real estate firmly, legally in her name, a worthless stretch of mud given as a joke. But as Madeleine looked at the faded parchment, a spark of stubborn defiance ignited in her chest. The Hayes family had taken her husband, her home, and her future. She was not going to let them break her spirit completely. 2 years passed. Madeleine had relocated to a cramped, drafty apartment in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. She had taken a grueling job at a local clinic, working double shifts just to keep her head above water. The grief over losing Jonathan had transformed from a sharp, stabbing pain into a dull, constant ache. But financial ruin was always knocking at her door. The final insult from the Hayes family was that the Terrebonne Parish swamp, while commercially useless, still accrued property taxes. For 2 years, Madeleine had scraped together the funds to pay the parish, refusing to let the property go into foreclosure out of pure, obstinate pride. It was her land. It was the only thing she owned, free and clear. One sweltering August afternoon, a letter arrived in her mailbox. It was an offer from a corporate agricultural developer that owned the dry land bordering her swamp. They were looking to expand a drainage pipeline and needed her 14 acres to run their industrial runoff. Their offer was insulting. $2,500 for the entire tractor. Madeleine sat at her small kitchen table, staring at the check they had pre-written to tempt her. $2,500 would pay off her lingering credit card debt and give her a month of breathing room. It was the logical choice. Sell the mud, take the cash, and finally sever the last tether connecting her to the Hayes family. But something in her gut twisted. Margaret Hayes's smug face flashed in her mind. If she sold the land for pennies, the joke would be complete. The wealthy elite would win again. "Before I sell this miserable bog," Madeleine muttered to her empty apartment, "I'm going to know exactly what I'm giving away." She needed an appraisal. Through a local community board, she found Benjamin Caldwell, an independent land surveyor who specialized in the volatile, shifting topographies of the Louisiana bayous. Benjamin was a man in his late 50s, with skin weathered like old leather and a quiet, methodical demeanor. He charged a flat fee that Madeleine could barely afford, but she hired him anyway. On a Tuesday morning, Madeleine drove out to Terrebonne Parish to meet Benjamin. The air was thick and heavy, smelling of decaying leaves and brackish water. The property was exactly as advertised, a dark, impenetrable canopy of moss-draped trees standing in knee-deep, murky water. The buzzing of insects was deafening. Not exactly prime real estate, Miss Hayes, Benjamin noted, adjusting his boots as he looked over the topographical map. Most folks wouldn't pay the taxes on a sinkhole like this. I know, Madeline said, crossing her arms. I just need to know exactly where the boundary lines are, and if there's any dry acreage at all before I sign it over to the developers. Benjamin nodded. He unloaded his gear from the back of his truck, a combination of traditional surveying tripods and modern ground-penetrating sonar equipment he used to map submerged terrain for state environmental agencies. For the first few hours, Madeline sat on the tailgate of Benjamin's truck, swatting away mosquitoes and questioning her own sanity. She watched Benjamin wade through the muck in high chest waders, planting his poles and taking readings. It was tedious, dirty work. Around noon, Benjamin's radio crackled. Miss Hayes, you might want to come take a look at this. Madeline pulled on the spare pair of rubber boots Benjamin had lent her and waded into the thick, foul-smelling mud. The water tugged at her legs, heavy and resisting. She found Benjamin standing near the center of the 14-acre tract, holding his digital sonar tablet. He looked perplexed. Did you find a patch of dry land? She asked hopefully. No, Benjamin replied, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. He tapped the screen of his tablet. This sonar reads density variations under the mud. Usually out here, it's just silt, clay, and maybe some scattered limestone bedrock about 50 feet down. But look at this. He held the screen out. Instead of the smooth, uniform colors indicating mud and rock, the screen displayed a massive, grid-like pattern of stark, solid red anomalies. It looked like a subterranean barcode. What is that? Madeline asked, squinting at the screen. Pipes? Too thick to be pipes, and they're layered, stacked, Benjamin said, his voice dropping into a hushed, reverent tone. Whatever this is, it spans almost your entire 14 acres, and it's resting just about 10 feet below the silt. Benjamin walked back to his gear bag and pulled out a long, hollow steel rod, a core sampler used to extract cross-sections of deep soil. Stand back, he warned. He positioned the rod over one of the sonar anomalies and began to drive it down into the murky water with a heavy mallet. The rod slid easily through the soft mud for several feet. Then, with a dull thud that vibrated through the water, it hit something solid. Benjamin grunted, twisting the T-handle at the top of the rod to drill into the obstruction. He worked for 10 minutes, sweat pouring down his face, before finally hauling the heavy steel rod back up out of the swamp. He unscrewed the collection tube and pushed out the core sample onto a white plastic tray. Madeline leaned in, expecting to see a chunk of rock, concrete, or perhaps rusted metal from some forgotten industrial dump site. Instead, sliding out of the metal tube was a perfectly intact, dark, rich cylinder of wood. But it wasn't rotting. It was incredibly dense, tightly grained, and emitted a faint, sweet, resinous smell that cut right through the stench of the swamp. Benjamin took a pocket knife and scraped away the outer layer of mud from the wood. The wood beneath was a breathtaking, vibrant olive green with streaks of deep amber. Benjamin's hands were trembling slightly as he looked up at Madeline. Miss Hayes, who did you say gave you this land? My in-laws, Madeline said, confused. They thought it was worthless. A slow, disbelieving smile spread across Benjamin's weathered face. Miss Hayes, this isn't just mud. Do you know what Sinker cypress is? Madeline shook her head. Back in the 1800s, Benjamin explained, his voice accelerating with excitement. Louisiana was aggressively logged for old-growth bald cypress. It's the most valuable wood in North America, waterproof, rot-resistant, beautiful. But the logs were so dense that when the lumberjacks tried to float them down the rivers and bayous to the mills, a lot of them sank to the bottom. Benjamin pointed to the massive grid on his sonar tablet. The mud here is anaerobic, meaning there's no oxygen. It acts as a perfect preservative. You don't just have a few lost logs down here, Madeline. You are standing on top of an untouched, forgotten staging ground. A 19th century logging graveyard. He picked up the small cylinder of wood. A single log of old-growth Sinca cypress can sell for up to $100,000 to custom furniture makers and luxury home builders. Your sonar shows hundreds of them, maybe thousands, stacked like cordwood under the mud. Madeline stared at the piece of wood, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The humid air suddenly felt thin. What are you saying, Benjamin?" she whispered. "I'm saying," Benjamin replied, looking out over the endless stretch of murky water, "that your in-laws didn't give you a worthless swamp. They handed you a timber gold mine. You're sitting on a multi-million-dollar fortune." The realization that she was standing atop a sunken fortune left Madeline entirely breathless. The oppressive, sweltering heat of the Louisiana afternoon suddenly felt entirely manageable. Benjamin Caldwell, wiping the thick layer of sweat and grime from his forehead, explained the staggering logistics of what lay ahead. Extracting Sinca cypress from an anaerobic environment was not a task for the faint of heart. It required specialized heavy machinery, certified commercial divers willing to plunge into the black, snake-infested waters, and an enormous amount of upfront capital. Madeline, who was currently budgeting her grocery shopping down to the very last cent, had absolutely no money to fund such a colossal operation. However, she possessed something significantly more valuable than cash, an ironclad determination fueled by years of swollen, agonizing grief and simmering resentment. She formed a legally binding partnership with Benjamin, offering him a generous percentage of the eventual profits in exchange for his continued expertise and industry connections. Through Benjamin's extensive network of bayou contractors, they were introduced to Harrison Miller, a rugged, seasoned salvage operator who had spent the better part of 3 decades pulling wrecked fishing trawlers and sunken industrial equipment from the muddy depths of the Gulf Coast. Harrison was instantly captivated by the sheer, unprecedented scale of the subterranean timber graveyard Benjamin had mapped out on his sonar tablet. To finance the massive extraction operation, Madeline took an incredibly terrifying risk. She leveraged the initial sonar data and the single core sample Benjamin had pulled from the mud to secure a massive, high-interest commercial loan from a specialized speculative investment firm in New Orleans. If the logs turned out to be rotten, or if the extraction costs spiraled out of control, she would be plunged into a level of inescapable debt that would undoubtedly ruin the remainder of her life. But Madeline signed the staggering loan documents without a single tremor in her hand. She had absolutely nothing left to lose. The operation commenced just 3 weeks later. The previously silent, forgotten 14-acre swamp was rapidly transformed into a bustling, deafening theater of industrial activity. Diesel engines roared from dawn until dusk as enormous crawler cranes, outfitted with specialized winches and thick steel cables, were carefully positioned on reinforced steel mats along the muddy banks. Harrison's team of commercial divers, clad in heavy protective dry suits, descended blindly into the murky, zero-visibility water. They communicated via 2-way radios, feeling their way through the pitch-black mud to locate the massive sunken logs and securely attach the heavy extraction cables around their enormous girths. The day the very first log was finally pulled from the depths was a moment permanently etched into Madeline's memory. The massive crane groaned and strained, its steel cables pulling taut as thick black water cascaded off the rising object. Slowly, violently breaking the surface of the swamp, came a colossal, ancient, bald cypress log. It was over 30 feet in length and nearly 5 feet in diameter, a staggering behemoth of timber that had rested undisturbed in the suffocating mud for over a century. When Harrison's crew power-washed the centuries of accumulated muck from its surface, the stunning, flawless olive green and amber grain was revealed. An independent timber appraiser stood by, meticulously measuring the wood. That single magnificent log was conservatively estimated to be worth $80,000 at wholesale auction. And according to Benjamin's sonar grid, there were hundreds more lying beneath the surface. However, the deafening noise of the heavy machinery and the sudden explosive influx of money into the impoverished parish did not go unnoticed. The corporate agricultural developer that had previously attempted to purchase the swamp for a pathetic $2,500 suddenly reappeared, completely abandoning their previous facade of polite corporate negotiation. They began sending aggressive, vaguely threatening cease and desist letters, demanding that the logging operation be halted immediately due to supposed environmental drainage concerns. Madeline, suspicious of their sudden, rabid desperation, hired a private investigator to dig into the shell company's complex corporate structure. The revelation that followed was a twist so deeply cynical it made her blood run cold. The agricultural developer was not a local farming conglomerate. It was an incredibly well-hidden, deeply nested subsidiary entirely owned and operated by Hayes Logistics. Margaret and Charles Hayes. The Hayes family had never cared about agricultural drainage. They possessed high-level corporate intelligence and had recently discovered, through back-channel state geological surveys, the high probability of valuable Sinker cypress resting beneath the very swamp they had spitefully gifted to their unwanted daughter-in-law. They had attempted to quietly buy it back for pennies on the dollar, assuming Madeline was desperate, uneducated, and easily manipulated. When they realized Madeline was actually extracting the multi-million-dollar fortune they believed rightfully belonged to their aristocratic dynasty, they completely dropped the shell company disguise. The full, terrifying might of the Hayes family's legal department descended upon Louisiana. They filed an emergency federal injunction, immediately halting the salvage operation. Their aggressive lawsuit claimed that the original deed transfer was fundamentally flawed. They ruthlessly argued that when Charles Hayes had transferred the property to Madeline, he had explicitly retained all subsurface mineral and natural resource rights, a vague, archaic legal loophole they intended to exploit to strip her of the timber. The extraction machinery fell silent. The swamp was locked down by court order. Margaret Hayes, thousands of miles away in her sprawling Connecticut mansion, was preparing to orchestrate the final, crushing destruction of the woman she blamed for her son's tragic demise. Madeline knew that standard legal representation would be utterly obliterated by the relentless, well-funded corporate machine of Hayes Logistics. She required an attorney who thrived in the absolute muddiest, most vicious trenches of property law. She found Victoria Hastings, a brilliantly ruthless, razor-sharp attorney based in New Orleans, who had built a formidable reputation exclusively by dismantling predatory corporations, attempting to exploit vulnerable Louisiana landowners. Victoria reviewed the convoluted injunction and the original spiteful deed of gift with a cold, calculating smile. She took the case on contingency, eager to publicly humiliate the arrogant northern shipping magnates. The ensuing courtroom showdown took place in a historic, stiflingly hot courthouse in downtown Baton Rouge. The tension within the dark, wood-paneled room was palpable, suffocatingly thick. Margaret and Charles Hayes arrived with an obnoxious entourage of perfectly tailored corporate lawyers, exuding an aura of untouchable, aristocratic confidence. Margaret wore a pristine, tailored white suit, casting disdainful, icy glares at Madeline across the heavy oak tables. They had hired Preston Gallagher, a terrifyingly expensive, silver-tongued litigator, renowned for completely destroying opposing counsel through sheer intimidation and exhausting legal attrition. Preston Gallagher immediately launched a blistering, highly technical offensive. He presented a mountain of complex, historical precedents, passionately arguing before the judge that subsurface rights inherently included anything resting below the topsoil. He boldly claimed that the sunken cypress logs, having been fully submerged in the mud for over a century, legally constituted a subsurface natural resource, entirely separate from the worthless surface rights gifted to Madeline. He painted Madeline as a greedy, opportunistic trespasser, illegally plundering the Hayes family's rightful, historical assets. When Victoria Hastings stood to deliver her counter-argument, the entire courtroom leaned forward. She didn't immediately address the complex definitions of subsurface resources. Instead, she methodically dismantled the core integrity of Charles Hayes. Through grueling, relentless subpoenas, Victoria had managed to acquire the original, decades-old purchase documents from when Charles had first acquired the 14-acre swamp. Victoria approached the center of the courtroom, holding a thick binder of heavily redacted financial records. She revealed the devastating, completely unexpected twist. Charles Hayes had not acquired the land randomly. Decades ago, one of his early shipping subsidiaries had faced immense federal fines for illegally dumping hazardous industrial waste. Charles had intentionally purchased this utterly isolated, worthless swamp through a blind trust for the sole, malicious purpose of using it as an untraceable, illegal dumping ground to hide the toxic evidence. Furthermore, he had fraudulently written off the massive devaluation of the property on his corporate taxes for over 20 years. The Sinker cypress logs were not just a hidden treasure. They were physically resting entirely on top of a buried, decades-old federal environmental crime. Victoria dramatically turned toward the visibly paling Charles Hayes. The plaintiff argues that they retained subsurface rights, Victoria announced, her voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. However, Louisiana property law explicitly states that a party cannot selectively claim natural resources on a property, while simultaneously abandoning that exact same property to illegally evade catastrophic environmental liabilities and federal taxation. By gifting this land to my client as an untaxed, unrecorded inheritance transfer to avoid scrutiny, they legally forfeited any and all claims to its contents. They cannot claim the treasure when they used the mud to bury their own corporate treason. The courtroom erupted into total chaotic pandemonium. Preston Gallagher frantically attempted to object, his previous unshakable confidence entirely shattered. But the presiding judge brutally slammed his gavel down, demanding silence. The revelation of the massive, historical tax fraud completely obliterated the Hayes family's legal standing. The judge not only unequivocally dissolved the injunction, immediately ruling completely in Madeline's favor, but he also officially forwarded Victoria's heavily documented findings directly to the Federal Environmental Protection Agency and the Internal Revenue Service. Margaret Hayes's pristine composure finally, utterly shattered. As the devastating verdict was read, She slumped forward in her expensive chair, burying her face in her trembling hands. The untouchable, aristocratic dynasty was instantly facing devastating federal indictments, crippling financial ruin, and highly publicized, humiliating criminal investigations. Madeline simply stood up, smoothed her inexpensive dress, and walked out of the courtroom without giving her former tormentors a single backward glance. The salvage operation immediately resumed with double the intensity. Over the next 18 months, Harrison Miller's dedicated crew successfully extracted over 3,000 pristine, old-growth Sinker cypress logs from the muddy depths of the Louisiana swamp. The incredibly rare, flawlessly preserved wood was highly coveted by international luxury developers, custom acoustic guitar manufacturers, and elite high-end furniture designers. The timber was systematically sold at premium, exclusive auctions, generating a staggering, unbelievable total revenue that exceeded $45 million. Madeline Foster, the pediatric nurse who had been cruelly thrown onto the street with nothing but a rusted sedan and a shoebox of painful memories, was now an extraordinarily wealthy, formidable empire builder. But unlike the toxic, greedy family that had callously attempted to destroy her, she utilized her newly acquired fortune with profound, undeniable grace. She established a highly successful, completely sustainable timber management foundation dedicated to legally, ethically restoring the fragile coastal wetlands of Louisiana. More importantly, she fully funded the construction of a state-of-the-art, desperately needed pediatric intensive care wing at the very Boston hospital where she had first met the love of her life. Above the gleaming modern entrance of the facility, a beautiful hand-carved plaque made of stunning olive-green Sinker cypress was permanently installed. It read, "The Jonathan Hayes Memorial Wing." The Hayes family had given her what they truly believed was a worthless, humiliating piece of deep, stagnant mud to forever remind her of her lowly place in the world. Instead, they had unwittingly handed her the exact tools required to completely rebuild her entirely shattered life, secure her permanent financial independence, and effortlessly, legally destroy their own corrupt, deceitful empire in the process. If Madeline's incredible journey from a grieving widow to a triumphant empire builder inspired you, please hit that like button and share this video with your friends. We bring you real-life stories of shocking twists, sweet revenge, and hidden treasures every single week. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support helps us uncover more amazing tales. Leave a quick comment below with your thoughts on her revenge.